$1.7 million. That is the specific figure sitting at the financial epicenter of the most combustible front office situation in the modern history of women's professional basketball. Not because the Indiana Fever lacked the revenue stream to pay it, not because the new WNBA economic structure renders it mathematically out of reach, but because everything emerging from that organization, the coaching hires, the public statements, the free agency priority declarations, points toward an institutional posture that is, at minimum, deeply uncomfortable to reconcile with the interests of the player who built the entire franchise's current commercial value. The blueprint is embedded in the fine print of a collective bargaining agreement the mainstream sports media stopped analyzing the moment the headline salary numbers were published. The comfortable sports news cycle wants to sell you a simple story. Stephanie White is a new coach establishing priorities. Retaining Kelsey Mitchell is standard veteran team building, and the Indiana Fever are simply navigating a complex roster construction challenge. That version of events asks you to ignore the salary cap arithmetic, ignore the specific contractual architecture of the new CBA, and ignore the deliberate, public language White chose when she identified Mitchell as the franchise's absolute #1 retention target. You were not built to ignore those things. You were built to connect them. And when you do, what comes into focus is not a coaching philosophy. What comes into focus is a financial power play with Caitlin Clark's long-term economic future in Indianapolis sitting directly in the crosshairs. If this is the kind of analysis that makes you pause and rewind, if this is why you're here instead of consuming the sanitized mainstream coverage, hit that like button right now. It signals to the algorithm that this content deserves a wider audience, and we have an enormous amount of ground to cover today. To fully understand what is actually at stake inside that Fever front office, the story has to begin not in the 2025 offseason, but in 2024, when Caitlin Clark fundamentally altered the economic reality of the entire league. When Clark was drafted first overall, the Indiana Fever were operating in near-total institutional irrelevance. 7 consecutive playoff absences, attendance figures that ranked among the league's lowest, a national television presence so minimal that broadcast windows were a luxury. By virtually every measurable metric, the Fever were a franchise slowly disappearing from the cultural conversation. What Clark did to that organization over the course of a single rookie season has no genuine historical parallel in women's professional sports. Every Fever home game sold out. Road arenas across the league logged record-breaking ticket sales on nights. Indiana appeared as the visiting team. WNBA broadcasts on ESPN began regularly exceeding NBA broadcasts in identical time slots, a first in the league's 28-year existence. The cumulative commercial pressure Clark generated created the conditions for the WNBA's landmark multi-year media rights deal, a contract that will redistribute enormous financial value across every franchise, every front office, and every player in the league for the next decade. Her economic fingerprints are on every negotiation happening in this ecosystem right now. The franchise valuation implications extended far beyond Indianapolis. Teams without any roster connection to Clark watched their estimated market values climb because the league Clark was playing in had become a genuinely premium media property. That context is not background noise. It is the foundation of every financial decision the Fever should be making. And it makes what appears to be unfolding inside that building not just frustrating. It is structurally difficult to explain from a pure asset management standpoint. Here is where the new collective bargaining agreement becomes the single most important document in this entire story. The new WNBA CBA contains a performance-based salary escalator built specifically into rookie-scale contracts. Under this structure, a player who earns all WNBA first or second team recognition across each of her first 3 professional seasons becomes eligible for a maximum 4th-year salary. And if that same player also secures the most valuable player award during that window, the escalator reaches its ceiling, a Supermax contract worth $1.7 million in year 4. This is, by any historical WNBA standard, a seismic compensation number. The Supermax clause represents the CBA's direct institutional acknowledgement that elite Oz transformative talent deserves compensation reflecting actual market reality. It was a provision designed with precisely the profile Caitlin Clark represents in mind. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Do you think the Indiana Fever front office is making these decisions with Clark's best interests in mind, or purely out of financial self-preservation? The community has been loud about this one, and we want the full range of perspectives in the thread below. The specific timeline the Supermax creates is not abstract. It is immediate, and it is already running. Clark entered the 2025 season as a first-team All-WNBA honoree from her rookie year. She enters the season co-favored alongside Aja Wilson of the Las Vegas Aces to win the Most Valuable Player award, the two players statistically most likely to claim that hardware based on every available projection model. If her 2025 performance earns her another All-WNBA designation, which her rookie statistical profile and the team's offensive infrastructure would historically make near certain, she arrives at her fourth season threshold fully positioned to trigger the Supermax with a single MVP award. The Fever's financial exposure is not hypothetical, it is scheduled. Alongside Clark, Aliyah Boston represents a simultaneous and equally significant financial pressure point. Boston, drafted second overall in 2023 and developed within Indiana's system, is approaching her own contract renewal window with a maximum extension projection sitting at approximately $1.3 million. That number is, by any reasonable assessment, entirely justified given her defensive impact, interior presence, and development trajectory. The Fever invested in Boston. They believe in her as a cornerstone piece. That belief is legitimate. The problem is that believing in Boston, believing in Clark's market value, and simultaneously committing to Kelsey Mitchell at maximum contract creates an arithmetic equation that cannot be resolved within the WNBA's current salary cap structure. Stephanie White arrived as Indiana's head coach this offseason, carrying genuine professional credentials. Her work with the Connecticut Sun organization, her involvement with USA Basketball. But one specific public statement immediately became the flashpoint that every analyst tracking the Fever's financial dynamics zeroed in on. White explicitly and publicly identified Kelsey Mitchell as the franchise's #1 free agency priority. She used direct language about wanting to build the offensive infrastructure around the veteran shooting guard. In isolation, that preference is a coaching opinion. In the context of the CBA escalators loading on Clark and Boston's contracts simultaneously, it functions as something considerably more consequential, a financial declaration with structural implications the front office has not publicly addressed. Market projections for a maximum long-term contract for Kelsey Mitchell land at approximately $1.4 million annually. And when you place that number alongside Clark's potential $1.7 million Supermax and Boston's $1.3 million extension, the salary cap mathematics enter territory that requires a genuinely impossible reconciliation. Run the arithmetic with the detached precision this situation actually deserves. $1.7 million for Clark at Supermax, $1.3 million for Boston at maximum extension, $1.4 million for Mitchell at maximum contract. That is a combined $4.4 million in salary committed to 3 players on a cap structure that cannot absorb that concentration and simultaneously fund a competitive supporting roster. The Fever cannot field a credible roster around 3 max-level contracts. The financial geometry simply does not close. The players who disappear from this equation are not peripheral. Elite perimeter defenders with the spacing and switching versatility to operate alongside Clark, players whose presence in the 2024 lineup created the offensive floor that made her rookie season statistically exceptional, become structurally unaffordable under maximum cap commitment to all 3 players. The chemistry that defined Indiana's most watchable basketball in recent memory required specific role players operating at specific salary levels. Overcommitting to veterans at the top of the cap destroys the conditions for that system to function. And you do not replace elite connective tissue with league minimum filler and expect a franchise player of Clark's caliber to perform at MVP caliber efficiency. This is where the conversation developing across the WNBA's most serious analytical communities moves from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming. The theory being constructed across multiple observer communities centers on a hypothesis that requires real examination. The financial incentive to prevent Clark from winning MVP this season is large enough to potentially shape on-court decision-making. If Clark wins MVP in 2025, the Fever are contractually obligated under the new CBA to offer her the $1.7 million Supermax in 2027. If she does not win MVP, they are not. That is not speculation. That is the literal architecture of the agreement. The question fans are raising loudly across X, Reddit, and every major WNBA podcast community is what that financial delta means for how this coaching staff manages Clark's statistical environment. Not officially confirmed, but the breadcrumbs lead to an uncomfortable destination. The mechanics by which a coaching staff could structurally constrain a player's MVP candidacy without making the interference obvious are not complicated, and the WNBA analytical community has been mapping them out in considerable detail. It begins with offensive system design, a half-court offense constructed around a volume isolation scorer, one that prioritizes individual shot generation over the transition speed. Space creation framework that maximizes Clark's statistical footprint fundamentally reshapes the environment she operates in. Fewer high-volume assist opportunities arising from early offense, fewer transition sequences where her processing speed becomes an overwhelming competitive advantage, fewer deep-range attempts from the areas where she has demonstrated devastating accuracy. Layer onto that the subtler mechanisms of narrative management, press conference language emphasizing team balance and shared offensive load, timeout patterns that interrupt Clark's natural momentum during her highest efficiency stretches, media framing that positions her assist production within a committee offense structure rather than identifying her as the unambiguous creative hub. None of these individual decisions would appear unusual in isolation. Assembled together, they create a statistical ceiling that could meaningfully affect MVP voting, which, in the WNBA, is conducted by a media panel heavily influenced by narrative framing as much as raw numbers. Before we continue, if our coverage has been your go-to source for what is actually happening beneath the surface of this league, becoming a channel member is the best way to make sure we can keep this going. Hit that join button below. Every member makes it possible to keep the research running and the analysis deep. Here is what rarely gets addressed in this conversation. The Fever possess an entirely legitimate strategic solution that sidesteps this collision, and they appear completely unwilling to execute it. The WNBA's core designation system allows franchises to retain a player's contractual rights without committing to maximum salary. Applied to Mitchell's specific situation, a front office operating with genuine championship-level strategic clarity would use the core designation to secure her rights, and then immediately leverage that exclusivity as trade currency on the open market. Mitchell has tangible value across the league. A veteran shooting guard with her scoring volume and professional pedigree is an asset that multiple franchises would move significant pieces to acquire. Trading that asset for elite rim-running front-court players capable of generating the pick-and-roll geometry that Clark's passing demands. Trading for switchable perimeter defenders who close out on corner threes when defenses collapse inward on Clark's gravity. That transaction sequence rebuilds Indiana's roster into an optimized system entirely constructed around maximizing the commercial and athletic output of the single asset responsible for the franchise's financial transformation. The analytical consensus across the WNBA observer community is that this path is available, executable, and mathematically superior to overpaying a veteran shooting guard while simultaneously watching the cap conditions around Clark deteriorate. The question is whether this front office has the institutional confidence to make a move that publicly acknowledges their entire organizational value is tied to one player, or whether the internal political dynamics of veteran relationships within that locker room make the trade functionally unthinkable. Share this breakdown with someone who follows the Fever closely, because this conversation about how the front office is managing Clark's future needs to reach the people paying attention to this franchise. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on notifications, because this situation is evolving every week and we are tracking every development. The consequence of getting this decision wrong extends well beyond a single contract dispute or one free agency cycle. Caitlin Clark is under contract with Indiana for the immediate future, but professional athletes with her commercial leverage and market profile are not passive participants in franchise management. They have representation that understands precisely what her value is worth on the open market. And when the 2027 free agency window opens, if it opens after seasons in which Clark was systematically underpaid relative to her generated revenue, her roster was chronically underfunded due to cap mismanagement, and her institutional narrative was managed in ways that suppressed her commercial positioning. The probability of her remaining in Indianapolis carries real uncertainty. The franchise valuation mathematics on that scenario are genuinely catastrophic. Indiana's estimated market value has climbed substantially since Clark's arrival. Sponsorships have entered the building that were not present before. Broadcast windows have expanded. The entire commercial infrastructure built around the Fever over the past 2 seasons was constructed on the implicit assumption that Caitlin Clark is a long-term institutional asset. Losing her to free agency or creating an organizational environment that motivates a departure does not just affect Indiana's win probability. It potentially reverses the most significant franchise appreciation generated in a 2-year window in WNBA history. That is not a marginal financial risk. That is an existential structural threat that the ownership group appears either unwilling or institutionally incapable of accurately pricing. The fan ecosystem is not passive about any of this. Social media has been running detailed analytical threads on the cap math, historical precedents from both the WNBA and NBA where franchise players were mismanaged out of their organizations, and player valuation breakdowns comparing Clark's commercial output to her contract timeline. The discourse is not coming from casual observers, it is coming from the analytical core of the WNBA audience, the demographic that drives streaming numbers, fills arenas on the road, and represents the commercial engine every sponsor inside the Indiana Fever building is paying to reach. When that audience reaches a consensus conclusion that management is operating against the interests of the player they came to watch, the downstream consequences go far beyond negative press coverage. Here is the forward-looking reality the Indiana Fever front office cannot insulate themselves from. The Supermax clock is already running, and every roster decision, every coaching directive, and every public statement issued between now and the final buzzer of the 2025 season will be evaluated against one foundational question. Did it maximize Caitlin Clark's MVP candidacy, or did it compromise it? The global audience is not confused about what it wants to watch. The sponsor community is not ambiguous about which asset drives their return on investment. The economic architecture of the new CBA was not designed to be navigated against the interests of the player. It was structurally built to reward, and the Fever front office's window to demonstrate through actual action, not corporate messaging, not press conference framing, that they genuinely understand what they are managing, is narrowing with every decision that centers the wrong conversation. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because the 2025 WNBA season is going to answer every question this video raised, game by game, possession by possession, press conference by press conference. Hit the notification bell so you catch every breakdown as this situation develops in real time. And the next video drops very soon. A full dissection of what the new CBA's financial architecture means for every star player approaching a contract decision across the league, not just Clark. The institutional pressure building inside women's professional basketball right now is bigger than any single franchise. We are going to map the entire board. Do not miss it.